This video is sponsored by Connell Guides. To get your hands on the most intelligent study guides on the market for GCSE and A-level English literature, as well as GCSE and A-level history, visit connellguides.com and use code RS15 at checkout for 15% off your order.
How is the theme of conflict and violence presented in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we're going to think about how the theme of conflict and violence is presented in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. To do that, we're going to start off by exploring what is meant by the theme of conflict and violence, and which ideas you might want to explore if given this theme in an exam or assessment. After that, we're going to discuss a whole bunch of quotations that relate to conflict and violence, analysing language and techniques as we go, and even including some contextual information where necessary too. At the end of the video, I will then pose a big question for you to think about, and if you're feeling up to it, answer in the comments section down below, which should hopefully strengthen your understanding of this key theme. My aim here is to help you out as you study or revise Shakespeare's play. If anything I say in this video is useful, please do let me know. You can drop it a like or write a comment on it, share it around with anyone else who might benefit from watching it, and you can subscribe to my channel too if you haven't done so already, which currently applies to more than 3/4 of you who watch my videos. So, now that you've clicked that lovely red subscribe button, which you have done, right? What exactly is meant by the theme of conflict and violence, especially within the context of Romeo and Juliet? So if you're thinking about the theme of conflict and violence in Shakespeare's play, there's one place or overarching idea that I think you really ought to use as your starting point: the Capulet-Montague feud. The fact that the two families have a long-standing hatred for each other does of course mean that their relationship is one of conflict, but the feud itself has many direct and indirect consequences that themselves are either violent or could be considered a form of conflict. Allow me to list a few different examples of the Capulet-Montague feud's direct consequences that could be considered violent or a form of conflict. When I say direct consequences, I mean that they are immediately caused by the hatred the families have for each other, and so they generally occur within or between the two families. So you could write about the violence that is apparent in the opening brawl and in the fight between Romeo and Tybalt. You could analyse the argument between Juliet and her parents when she tells them that she will marry Romeo instead of Paris, or you could explore the inner conflict Juliet experiences when she has to make the choice between her family and the man she loves. If you wanted to go a bit outside of the box, you might want to explore how conflict and violence manifest in the indirect consequences of the Capulet-Montague feud. In other words, you could think about how the feud affects people outside of the play's two main families. That means you could discuss how Mercutio and Paris are violently killed as an indirect consequence of the feud. Mercutio dies defending his friend, and Paris is killed because he prevents Romeo, who is enraged because he mistakenly thinks that Juliet is dead, from seeing his wife. You might also want to think about how Friar Lawrence interacts with the feud as well. On the one hand, he does try to resolve it, but on the other hand, he becomes the victim of conflict when the distraught Romeo lashes out at him, as we will talk about later on in this video. You could even think about the minor conflict between Romeo and the apothecary towards the end of the play, in which Romeo coerces the poor man to sell him some poison. So then, where do conflict and violence appear in Romeo and Juliet? The answer is in absolutely loads of places. Just look for the feud and the consequences that it has. So now it's time to analyse some quotations, and our first quotation that relates to conflict and violence occurs in the play's opening scene. As I'm sure you know, a big fight takes place in this scene. Although it initially begins as a fight between Capulet and Montague's servants, it escalates when Tybalt and Benvolio enter the scene, escalates further again when the townspeople try to intervene, and escalates further still when Lord Capulet and Lord Montague try to get involved. However, rather than looking directly at this fight, I'd like to look at something that is said immediately before it. So let's look at a line from Gregory, one of the Capulet servants. Speaking about the Montagues with his fellow Capulet servant, Gregory says, "The quarrel is between our masters and us their men." For me, this quotation highlights the universality of conflict in Shakespeare's play. Conflict is of course alluded to by the noun quarrel, and the juxtaposition between masters and us their men indicates that conflict transcends class boundaries because both rich and poor alike take part in the Capulet-Montague feud, hence suggesting that the conflict is universal. Furthermore, by placing this quotation, and the fight that follows it, right at the start of his play, Shakespeare creates the impression that the theme of conflict and violence will be integral to Romeo and Juliet. This may create tension, for the audience are aware that the play is also a love story, and so they may be concerned about how and when conflict or violence might interfere in the romance between the titular characters. Now let's jump to the Capulet ball scene, which is a part of the play in which violence threatens to erupt. In particular, we're going to look at Tybalt's reaction to finding out that a Montague is at the party. But what is that reaction? It is, "This, by his voice, should be a Montague. Fetch me my rapier, boy." With the theme of conflict and violence in mind, we could say a couple of different things about this quotation. First, it sees Shakespeare associate violence with authority. This is because Tybalt's line, "Fetch me my rapier," is an imperative sentence. When coupled with the noun boy, which in this context sees Tybalt refer to his personal servant, Shakespeare creates the impression that Tybalt's authority and his violent tendencies are interconnected, given that the young man uses one of these qualities to enable the other. Second, you could argue that these lines present Tybalt as somewhat agitated. This is because the implementation of caesure occurs with such frequency that the rhythm of Tybalt's dialogue is severely broken up, which suggests to me that he is unable to express himself fluidly, as is the extent of his agitation. But what has agitated him? The fact that he has heard a Montague voice. This therefore creates the impression that the Montague-Capulet conflict is so powerful that it overrides people's abilities to enjoy themselves and have a happy time. After all, Tybalt is supposed to be at a family party, and yet all he can think about is violence. Let's stick in Act 1 Scene 5 for our next quotation and look at something that Juliet says after meeting Romeo, which is, "I must love a loathed enemy." Now of course this quotation is relevant to the theme of love and the theme of family and relationships, two themes I've already made videos about, so do make sure to check those out. However, this quotation can also be analysed with the theme of conflict and violence in mind. You see, this line could be interpreted as depicting Juliet experiencing inner conflict. Shakespeare employs alliteration to highlight the contrast between love and loathed. This contrast indicates that Juliet feels torn between her romantic feelings for Romeo, as indicated by love, and her sense of family loyalty, a notion implied by the adjective loathed, for this recalls the fact that the Capulets despise the Montagues. Indeed, referring to Romeo as her enemy reinforces the sense of family loyalty that Juliet feels obligated to uphold. Furthermore, Juliet's inner conflict is made all the more apparent by the modal verb must in her dialogue. As far as modal verbs go, this is a pretty strong one that implies that Juliet feels compelled to love Romeo. She's almost helpless to do anything else. Given that this compulsion is in direct opposition with her sense of family loyalty, thanks to the feud, we get the impression that Juliet really is torn. Her love for Romeo is not just a fleeting temptation, but something that has completely transformed her allegiances and priorities. Next, I would like to consider something Juliet says in Act 2, Scene 2, the balcony scene, for I think you could argue that it is especially relevant to the theme of conflict. Let's have a look at 4 lines, which are, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or, if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet." Alright, so these are some of Juliet's most memorable lines from across the entire play. But how do they relate to the theme of conflict and violence? Juliet's opening question, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" reveals that she is aware that the feud, a key conflict in the play of course, will be a barrier to hers and Romeo's happiness, suggesting that she is torn between family loyalty and her desire for the young Montague. This is because the question word "wherefore" means why, and when put together with her later rumination on names and family, we come to understand that Juliet is questioning why something so petty will prevent the two of them from being happy together. But that is not to say that this is a pessimistic quotation. Rather than acknowledging that there is a feud and accepting defeat, Juliet provides a solution to the problem that the feud poses. When Juliet says that Romeo could deny his father and refuse his name, she suggests that the barrier posed by the feud can be overcome if Romeo were to abandon his family, and if he is not prepared to do this, Juliet offers to no longer be a Capulet and thus turn her back on her own flesh and blood. Now, these solutions would have appeared fairly extreme to Shakespeare's audience, given the importance of family loyalty in both Elizabethan England and Renaissance Verona. And so perhaps Shakespeare wants to highlight just how ridiculous the Capulet-Montague feud is, encouraging his audience to consider whether the grudges they hold in life are likewise ridiculous. Regardless, by presenting his character figuring out a peaceful resolution to quite a bitter and violent grudge, Shakespeare provides hope because he suggests that even the most extreme conflicts can be overcome. Okay, let's jump to Act 3, Scene 1, which is probably the scene that features the most violence in Romeo and Juliet, given that it is the scene in which Mercutio and Tybalt are both killed. At the start of this scene, Benvolio says something that leads me to think that the violence that occurs in this part of the play is not necessarily in the character's control. The quotation that makes me think this is, "I pray thee, good Mercutio, let's retire. The day is hot." So in these lines, Benvolio asks Mercutio if they can go and hang out indoors somewhere because it is a very hot day, which makes people's blood hot and therefore makes violence more likely. Extreme heat agitates people. That's almost a universal experience. I'm sure you find it much harder to concentrate in school during the summer months because it is too warm, and you'd rather be out and about and doing something a bit more active. Well, this was also true in Shakespeare's time. Hot weather was associated with physical activity, including violence. Benvolio's line, "The day is hot," therefore sees Shakespeare employ pathetic fallacy because it anticipates the violence that occurs later on in the scene. This is why I suggest that the violence of Act 3, Scene 1 is not necessarily in the character's control. The weather is hot, which makes people feel more irritable, passionate, and prone to taking part in violent activity. As such, Tybalt and Mercutio and Romeo cannot be fully blamed for the aggressiveness they show during this part of the play. This even makes me wonder if Benvolio's line, "The day is hot," not only relates to the theme of violence because it foreshadows violence, but perhaps if it also relates to the theme of fate as well, as the hot weather makes the scene's violence seem inevitable. Let's stick in Act 3, Scene 1 for our next quotation. Despite the hot weather, Romeo does try to defuse the situation by apologising to Tybalt, to which the young man replies, "Boy, this shall not excuse the injuries that thou hast done to me, therefore turn and draw." These lines suggest that violence is stubborn and unstoppable and that it does not listen to reason. This is of course apparent in how Tybalt states that Romeo's apology does not excuse the injuries that he has done to Tybalt, the injury being Romeo's presence at the Capulet ball most probably, because this sees Tybalt dismiss Romeo's peaceful sentiments. However, violence's stubbornness and unstoppability is also evident in how Tybalt refers to Romeo by using the noun boy. This is because boy was an insult in Shakespeare's time, at least when used to refer to somebody who is your societal equal, because it suggests that you think that they are in fact inferior to you. Because Tybalt continues to insult Romeo, we get the impression that he is still looking for a fight, and that this desire has not been unperturbed by Romeo's efforts to de-escalate things. This impression is further reinforced by Tybalt's imperative turn and draw, because he is not asking Romeo to take part in a fight with him, but commanding him. It seems that Tybalt really is determined in his desire to be violent, and that this cannot be swayed whatsoever. Okay, let's move forwards to Act 3, Scene 3, and consider something that Romeo says there. His sadness is evident throughout this scene, and its cause is that he believes that his banishment from Verona, a direct consequence of the Capulet-Montague feud, will mean that he and Juliet will be separated. Friar Lawrence tries to reassure Romeo throughout this scene that things aren't actually all that bad, because banishment is better than death after all. However, this prompts Romeo to retort, "Thou canst not speak of that thou dost not feel. Wert thou as young as I,
Juliet thy love,
and now but married, Tybalt murdered, doting like me, and like me banished, then mightest thou speak." Here we see that extreme emotions can cause us to turn on our friends and lash out at them verbally. In other words, this quotation shows that sadness can prompt further conflict. This effect is mostly achieved by Romeo's repetition of the negation not in the top line here, for it sees him outright dismiss the friar's words, as evidenced by speak, and emotions, as indicated by feel. Romeo rejects the friar's words because he is not young, newly married, and suddenly banished. It is the references to romance and love, as seen in Love, Married, and Doting, that particularly suggest that Romeo is lashing out at Friar Lawrence, for it sees the young man remind the friar that he is not allowed to fall in love and get married because of his duties as a Franciscan monk. In other words, Romeo suggests that Friar Lawrence will not and cannot understand his sadness because the older man is unable to experience romantic love. Reminding the friar of this seems particularly unkind, especially given how supportive Friar Lawrence is of Romeo throughout the entire play, including in this scene. As such, we see that Romeo's extreme sadness has caused him to lash out at his close ally. This could suggest that conflict and its consequences can transform our relationships, or even that conflict can cause further conflict, for the fallout of the Montague-Capulet feud has triggered a conflict within the relationship Romeo and Friar Lawrence share. Later in Act 3, we have Act 3, Scene 5, the part of the play in which Juliet informs her parents that she will not be marrying Paris. This, of course, sparks a big argument between herself and her parents, a key quotation from which is, "Doth she not give us thanks? Is she not proud? Doth she not count her blessed, unworthy as she is, that we have wrought so worthy a gentleman to be her bride?" This quotation occurs shortly after Lord Capulet enters the scene, and before he explodes in an abusive rage directed at his daughter. I've chosen these lines to focus on because they show us exactly why such a big conflict erupts between Juliet and her parents. In short, they show that conflict emerges when authority is challenged. Lord Capulet's frequent questions begin to create this impression for me. Rather than being rhetorical questions, they are questions made out of genuine confusion. He is so used to being obeyed that he struggles to comprehend the thought that his daughter might reject his parental authority over her. Indeed, it appears that Lord Capulet takes Juliet's refusal to marry Paris personally. This impression is created by his use of us and we, for these first-person pronouns show that Lord Capulet emphasises the work he and his wife put into arranging Juliet's marriage. Following his confusion and personal offence, Lord Capulet begins to insult his daughter, calling her unworthy. This denigration marks the beginning of the argument in this scene, a conflict that includes threats of violence and disownment. But what exactly is it that causes such a large conflict to emerge? The fact that Juliet has challenged the authority her parents have over her. For our final two quotations that relate to the theme of conflict and violence, I would like to take us to the play's final scene. To begin, let's have a look at something said by Paris shortly after he and Romeo fight, which is, "Oh, I am slain!" Yep, that's right. I want us to think about the quotation that signifies Paris's death. Why? Because I think it could prompt a couple of different analyses that relate to the theme of conflict and violence. The first is that it could be interpreted as presenting violence as excessive. Earlier in this scene, Romeo tells Paris to be gone, and so him being slain could have in fact been avoided. As such, because Paris dies somewhat unnecessarily, we see that violence really can be quite over the top, or can, or should, be avoided. Alternatively, you could argue that this quotation presents conflict as being like a black hole. Paris is the third character to die following a fight in Romeo and Juliet, with the other two being Mercutio and Paris. Although Mercutio had a strong connection to the Montagues thanks to his friendship with Romeo, and Tybalt had a strong connection to the Capulets because he is Lord Capulet's nephew by marriage, Paris's connection is a bit more tenuous. Although he and Juliet are technically betrothed, their relationship is really underdeveloped, and nor is his relationship with Lord Capulet shown to be much more than a business connection. Despite the weakness of this connection, Paris is still consumed by the Capulet-Montague feud, much like a black hole, the consequence of which is that he loses his life. But violence is not just something that people do to each other in Shakespeare's play. Self-violence also features prominently at the end of it, as is signified by Juliet's lines when she says, "Then I'll be brief. O happy dagger, this is thy sheath. There rust, and let me die." Juliet's personification of the dagger with which she kills herself as happy creates the impression that violence can be a positive phenomenon if it allows people to get things that they want. In Juliet's case, the thing she desires is a reunion with Romeo, something that she will only be able to get in death, given that he has killed himself only moments earlier. Because Juliet has taken control of her situation and has decided to take her own life in order to resolve it, you could also say that violence is associated with power in this quotation, because it allows the young woman to reclaim a sense of autonomy. In fact, the line, "O happy dagger," also associates violence with power because Juliet's act of suicide enables her to finally overcome the conflict of the Capulet-Montague feud, the very thing that prevented her and Romeo from being happily together, albeit by committing a greater act of violence, perhaps suggesting that the only way to overcome violence is by committing increasingly greater acts of violence. However, just because this quotation suggests that violence is a good thing, that does not necessarily mean that Shakespeare is glorifying violence in this part of the play. If anything, it may have been written so that Shakespeare could demonise violence. You see, suicide is considered a sin in Christian belief, and so Juliet's act of suicide would not have only shocked Shakespeare's largely Christian audience, but her joy at the thought of committing suicide would have been doubly shocking for them. In trying to shock his audience, Shakespeare may have been trying to tell them that violence is in fact never a positive phenomenon, no matter how it may benefit you, and so he may have been trying to encourage his audience to behave in a much more peaceful way. By my count, that is 10 quotations that are relevant to the theme of conflict and violence in Romeo and Juliet, analysed. As such, I will wrap up my thematic analysis there, but that does not mean that you should close the video just yet, because doing so would mean that you would miss out on today's big question, and you wouldn't want that, would you? So then, today's big question is, was Shakespeare's play full of conflict and violence in order to make it entertaining, or does Shakespeare's use of this theme have a deeper moral message? Now, what you do with that question is completely up to you. It could be used to form the basis of a flashcard or mind map. It could stimulate discussion and debate with your friends and classmates if you are revising together, or it could even prompt a short evaluative paragraph. And you know where would be the perfect home for that paragraph? That's right, the comments section down below. Honestly, I love seeing the brilliant ideas that you lot come up with, and if you're feeling brave enough to share them with me, I will make sure to respect that by giving them a read and some quick feedback too. So why not give it a go? I look forward to reading what you have to say. And with that question still lingering in your mind, I guess it is time to wrap up this video. I genuinely do hope that you found this video to be helpful and that you feel a bit more confident when it comes to studying or revising Shakespeare's play as a result of watching it. If this video has indeed helped you out, please do consider giving it a like, writing a comment on it to let me know, sharing it around with anybody else who might benefit from watching it, and also, subscribing to my channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for watching, especially, right to the end. Please remember that, as always, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So how is the theme of conflict and violence presented in Shakespeare's play? Well, it seems that conflict and violence absolutely dominate Veronese society, thanks to the direct and indirect consequences of the Capulet-Montague feud. Now, these consequences appear to escalate and escalate and escalate, finally culminating in the suicide of a pair of young lovers, the ultimate act of self-violence that ends the feud once and for all.